So this is A View from a Bridge, and we're focusing on Act 1, thinking about the action and the plot. You always need to remember that your controlled assessment question is about relationships, and that you are exploring the ways in which the relationship between Eddie and Kathryn is presented in the drama text. So all the way through Act 1, think about what you learn about their relationship, how the audience is meant to see their relationship, and what Arthur Miller wants us to think about the way they interact with each other. And you need to be picking out from the text examples and quotations and making sure that you've underlined and highlighted anything that would be useful. So, Act 1, Part 1, we've got the Carboni, so that's Eddie, Beatrice and Kathryn, waiting for Beatrice's cousins, the Italians, to arrive. And initially we get Alfieri, who's the lawyer, and he's the sort of narrator of A View from a Bridge. He talks about justice and he talks about law in the Red Hook area, which is a poor area of Brooklyn. And these are some of the important themes in the play, and we spoke about justice as meaning fairness, being treated fairly. And there's an idea that sometimes the law doesn't actually cover that, and maybe people take the law and take justice into their own hands. We've got Eddie Carboni set up as one of the main characters. We talked about him being a tragic hero, if we think about Greek tragedy, and how Greek tragic heroes often have a fatal flaw. There's something about their character that leads to their downfall at the end, so we know that something bad is going to happen. He's a longshoreman, he's an ordinary guy, and he goes into his house initially, talks to Beatrice, his wife, and to his niece, Kathryn. Kathryn is upset because Eddie is very critical of her clothes and of her behaviour, and we get the sense here that he may be acting as a father to her. She's being looked after by Beatrice because her mother is dead. And Eddie's obviously taken on that fatherly role. He informs Beatrice and Kathryn that Marco and Rodolfo have arrived, so the Italians have arrived at the docks, and Beatrice is very nervous about this. She's worried the cousins won't like the place, they won't appreciate how small it is, and she's worried that she hasn't prepared it properly. Kathryn then prepares to tell Eddie about her new job. So, at the beginning, we've got the scene that's set for us, and we're introduced to the main characters. And we've got Eddie, who appears very overprotective as a father figure, but as a strong family man as well, and also quite an ordinary person. There's nothing standing out about him to start with. Kathryn seems to be quite a lively character. She's attractive, she's warm, she's annoyed when Eddie criticises her. But their relationship, apart from that, seems to be quite loving and caring. So if you're looking at this part of the act, you need to think about what is useful for your assessment. So this is good for showing their relationship at the beginning of the play. You can see that they've got that father-daughter type relationship. I've made a really bad spelling mistake there, sorry. Although there is a hint of the tension that begins to build. And we see that moment where Kathryn lights Eddie's cigar as a very intimate moment, which is a contrast to how Eddie is with Beatrice. Beatrice is in the kitchen at that point, doing the dishes like the good little housewife that she is, and Kathryn's the one that goes and sits on the arm of Eddie's chair and lights his cigarette, which we could see as quite a seductive moment in films and things like that. That's often seen as quite a seductive action. So then we move on to part 2, which is where Eddie objects to Kathryn leaving. She's told him about her job now, and he is absolutely adamant that she should not work for the plumbing company near the Navy Yard. His objections mainly stem from the fact that there'll be a lot of men there. He doesn't like that idea at all. Beatrice becomes angry then when Eddie rejects her advice to let Kathryn have her freedom, but eventually she does manage to persuade him to let Kathryn go, and Kathryn is very emotional when that happens. There's a bit of a family atmosphere that's created, but then the atmosphere changes again when Kathryn worries about hiding the cousin's identity. And Beatrice then tells a story of Vinnie Balzano and how he became an outcast for informing on his uncle. And there's a sense that perhaps that story is going to be relevant later on in this play. In a quiet moment, Eddie turns to Kathryn and says he never expected her to grow up. And we get a sense there that he's almost mourning her movement into womanhood. Eddie asks Bea why she's always angry with him, and she says that she's not. He's misunderstanding it. And in this part of the act, the audience realises how reluctant Eddie is to let Kathryn go. And we see that he seems quite vulnerable and lost. He seems to be terrified of losing her. And he says things like, "Please do me a favour, will you? I want you to be with different kind of people," suggesting that he wants what's best for her. He wants her to be in a higher type of society, and then you'll move away. So we're confused really about what he actually wants. Does he want to keep her as a child? Is he terrified that he will lose her from his life? Or is it something a little bit more sinister than that? And the quote where he says, "I guess I just never figured on one thing, that you would ever grow up," seems to suggest this idea that he wants to keep her as a child, perhaps so that he can continue to control her, to have that power over her, or that she will just always be special to him and they will be the only ones that have that relationship. Kathryn tries to reassure him, and she's quite light-hearted. She doesn't seem to understand the depth of his emotions for her, and she says flippantly, "You sound like I'm going a million miles away," and doesn't really seem to understand why he's so upset. In this part, Beatrice shows her strength when she stands up to Eddie, and Eddie actually gives in and does allow Beatrice's what she's saying to happen. And we also see that tension between Beatrice and Eddie, and realise that actually their relationship is not what it should be. This moment of intimacy with the cigar shows us that Kathryn is quite an innocent character. She's naive. She can't see how obsessive Eddie is, and she just loves him quite innocently, as a child would love their father. Moving on to Act 1, Part 3, is when the Italian cousins arrive, and Alfieri tells the audience that the cousins docked at 10 a.m. They then arrive and receive quite a warm welcome from everybody, and we see that contrast between the two brothers. So we've got Marco, who wants money for his wife and his children, whereas Rodolfo's more light-hearted. He's got all these romantic dreams. He's got this kind of idyllic idea of buying a motorbike, driving around, and that's what he's focused on. Rodolfo sings Paper Doll, which makes Eddie feel really uncomfortable. Superficially, so on the surface, he suggests that this is all about people overhearing and reporting him or reporting them to immigration, but actually you get the sense that it's more than that. It's the fact that he's jealous of Kathryn's reaction to Rodolfo and how much she is enthralled by him, how she likes to listen to him. Eddie then insists that Kathryn changes her shoes, so he calls her Garbo as well, suggesting a reference there to Greta Garbo, the film star. And all the way through he makes these sort of snide comments to her about the way that she looks, the way that she's dressing. And we see a bit of his power there because she doesn't question him, she goes and changes out of those shoes straight away. And there's a sense that he thinks she's trying to make herself look good for Rodolfo, and that's why he gets her to do that. So Kathryn is clearly fascinated with Rodolfo, and we see that partly through the stage direction. She's enthralled by him. She's under a sort of spell when she listens to him. And this is really the beginning of Eddie's hostility towards Rodolfo. He does not want him to sing, tells him to stop. He's then quite petty when he asks Kathryn to take off her high heels, put something else on. And we also see through the stage directions again this feeling that he's quite unsettled by Rodolfo. When he's singing, he rises and moves upstage. He calls him a kid, suggesting that he's less than a man. He's just a boy. He's not on the same level as Eddie. He's not equal with him. And we see that animosity that he has towards him from this moment on. In part 4, Eddie's hostility towards Rodolfo grows even further. Alfieri makes another entrance and he suggests that Eddie's life will never be the same again. He's not just this ordinary, simple man anymore. He's got this added tension in his life. And Eddie becomes more and more upset and obsessed that Rodolfo is spending his time with Kathryn and making a public show of himself. They go to the cinema, he's waiting outside for them to come back. Beatrice tells Eddie that he's jealous of Rodolfo and his interest in their relationship is unhealthy. And she then tries to discuss her own relationship with Eddie, but he walks out. He won't have that conversation with her. And in class we discussed how Eddie is impotent on a number of different levels. We said sexually impotent, he can't actually have a physical relationship with his wife, but we also said that he's impotent in the sense that he's powerless in this situation. He can't talk about it, he's not articulate enough or sensitive enough or intelligent enough to talk about his feelings, and he just shuts it down when Bea tries to talk to him. Eddie tells Kathryn that Rodolfo is only interested in her for a visa, and this is quite a malicious thing to suggest because she hadn't thought about that possibility, and that starts to set things moving in her mind that actually that could be true. Beatrice tells Kathryn that she needs to just break away from Eddie, she needs to grow up, stop wandering around in a nightie, sitting on the edge of the bath while he's shaving, having a nice little chat with him. That all has to stop because that's giving Eddie ideas, even though Kathryn isn't trying to do that. Eddie then visits Alfieri and tries to persuade him that Rodolfo's breaking the law so that he can deal with him and get some justice for what he feels is an injustice that's been done to him. Alfieri tells him that actually the only point of law that he's breaking is illegal immigration. There's nothing that he can do to stop the relationship between Rodolfo and Kathryn. And Eddie now seems to be quite desperate. And Alfieri is aware and makes us aware as the audience that Eddie is about to destroy himself and also the people that are closest to him. Eddie's hostility to Rodolfo has really hardened by this point and he doesn't seem capable of thinking about anything else. And we get some added tension from Beatrice confronting Eddie about their relationship and also his interest in Kathryn. So we know that she's aware that this is unhealthy, it's not right. And we see Eddie's desperation when he visits Alfieri, and we get this sense of foreboding because we know what happened with Vinnie Balzano. There's a reason why we've been told that story, and perhaps that's something suggested that might happen again. There's a quote where Eddie says, "But I know what they're laughing at, and when I think of that guy laying his hands on her, it's eating me out, Mr. Alfieri, because I struggled," because I struggled for that girl, and now he comes in my house and we really see Eddie's frustration in these lines. He feels a desperation that he can't verbalise properly. Kathryn, there's that impotency when he speaks. But the audience sees what he's trying to say, which is basically that Kathryn's rejected Eddie, who is a real man who struggled for her, and that's very different to what he feels Rodolfo is, who he sees as just an effeminate boy, a very feminine boy who isn't a real man, and he feels that there's been an injustice done. At the end of Act 1, Part 5, Marco confronts Eddie. Eddie continues to control the atmosphere in the scene, and he kills this relaxed mood that the family is in. Marco says he's happy that he can send money to his wife, but Eddie, again, quite maliciously suggests that his wife might be unfaithful. Rodolfo says to Eddie, that's not an option. There's a strict code of conduct in Italy, so Marco's wife will be faithful to him. And Eddie tells him that he is breaking the American code when he takes Kathryn out without his permission. So he suggests that he, as the father, has a say in who Kathryn sees, and he doesn't want her seeing him. Marco supports Eddie in this, but then as the scene progresses, Beatrice encourages Kathryn to show her independence from Eddie by dancing with Rodolfo. Eddie then attempts to assert himself over Rodolfo by suggesting that Rodolfo's skills show he is not manly. So singing, dancing, all of these things he suggests are quite feminine things, and as such he isn't a man. He tears up the newspaper in two, implying that he could easily do the same to the Italians. So he's trying again, a bit like a big dog, to just assert his authority, show where his territory is and who's in charge. He has this boxing, not a fight as such, but he tries to teach Rodolfo how to box and actually ends up hitting him in that process. Marco then decides enough is enough, and he lifts a chair above his head with one hand to show that he is stronger than Eddie and to exert a bit of his authority over the situation. Alfieri, in this part of Act 1, begins to prepare the audience for the tragedy to come. We start to understand that something terrible is going to happen. Eddie is quite cunning when he attempts to manipulate Marco and Rodolfo, but at this point he doesn't realise that Marco is actually a really strong person, a really strong character. Beatrice continues to encourage and support Kathryn in showing her independence, and at the end, this trial of strength, all of the characters see that in a different way. Beatrice just sees a friendly rivalry. She doesn't see anything sinister or unusual in it. Kathryn is really fearful for Rodolfo's safety, and we see here where she actually takes his side over Eddie. Marco is cautious at first, but then he decides to react. He sees Eddie's actions with Rodolfo and striking Rodolfo as hostile, and he challenges him to a trial of strength. So, your homework question. As you're going to be writing in your controlled assessment about what you know and what you learn about Eddie and Kathryn's relationship throughout the whole of the book, I would like you to focus for this question just about their relationship in Act 1. So I'd like you to write about what do you learn about Eddie's character and how he feels about Kathryn, what you learn about Kathryn and how she feels about Eddie, and finally, how do other characters affect their relationship? So if you could focus on those three areas, you need to use your book, you need to find quotations from the book that will be useful for you, and you need to think about the 7 stages when you're writing and see if you can add as much detail to your explanation as you can. Sorry about the spelling mistakes.